Welcome to Rural Remix, your source for deeper, richer stories about life in rural places. Where do horror movies happen? Small towns, dark forests, cornfields, and farmhouses have each been the locations for iconic scary films. But why are rural settings so popular, and how do these choices affect the areas represented? The Rural Horror Picture Show is a 5-part series that explores the often flawed but always interesting depiction of rural people and places in horror movies. Today we're talking about the fear of isolation, both physical and emotional, and how it's connected to portrayals of grief in rural horror movies. Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the Rural Horror Picture Show. I'm Anya Patron-Slepian.
I'm Susanna Brown.
And today is another episode led by Susanna. Before we get started, though, with whatever mysterious thing we're going to talk about today, I have a question for you, Susanna, which is that in the last episode we talked about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which is one of the most famous horror and slasher movies out there.
Yeah.
And, we talk a lot about tropes and the different roles that characters seem to play in horror movies. And so my question for you is, if you were in that movie, if you were in that situation, who are you? What are you doing?
It's certainly not going well for me. I think that in any kind of question of who'd survive a zombie apocalypse, any sort of disaster scenario, I don't think anyone's picking me, and I'm okay with that. That's fine. But okay, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre situation. Well, one, I'm probably not going out and exploring and walking into random homes or straying far from the group, So maybe that puts me in a better situation. Totally realistically, I would just be paralyzed in fear and it just wouldn't end well for me. I would be too spooked to protect myself in any real way. What about you?
Yeah, no, I think that is very fair, and I'd be in a similar situation. I'm not known for my survival skills. My hand-to-hand combat is a little rusty / non-existent. So yeah, if somebody's chasing me down with the thing, I did do cross-country in high school, so maybe my endurance running could help me out. But my sense of direction is really poor. So
you might run into the danger.
I think it's really possible. Yeah, and but similarly, I'm not about to just go into random people's houses.
Mm-hmm.
I do relate with the girl who I think dies the most gruesomely, where her friend goes into the house, he doesn't come back, and she goes in there to look for him. I think that's something I would feel bad just leaving. I wouldn't feel good about walking away from that. But unprompted, I'm not walking into a stranger's house.
Honestly, that made me think of I think my FOMO is going to be the thing that kills me. Oh, my friend went in there, oh, I bet they're having fun. I'll go in there too. So maybe I lied when I said I wouldn't go into places that I shouldn't go into, because I think FOMO might be the death of me.
Yeah, just, gotta follow the fun, but then it turns out not a lot of fun. So on that note, Susanna, what are we talking about today?
Yeah. So today I want to talk about a couple of different things that we see a lot in horror movies, and those are both the concepts of isolation, and then we're going to get into a conversation about grief being a really prevalent emotion in horror movies. So I think to start out, it would be helpful to kind of think about setting a little more, which is, something we've talked a lot about in these episodes. It's a big theme of this podcast, given that we are the Rural Horror Picture Show. But just throughout kind of all horror movies, the idea of being alone, being isolated is so common. The haunted lone cabin on the hill, friends camping alone in the woods, a family alone in an unfamiliar hotel, like The Shining, that, no one's there to hear your screams. You can't call for help. It's this just really common thing, which is preying on the fear of being alone, being isolated. And we see that in a lot of these movies where the landscape really just becomes an active character in the drama, in the horror, by becoming the thing that is isolating our main characters. When reading a lot about what makes this so scary, right? It's something that feels pretty obvious, right? We're basically all humans are kind of afraid of being alone. In different capacities, but
every capacity.
Yeah. And one thing I read that I think sort of sums up this feeling very well is that empty space, right? Like that isolating landscape, it helps do what horror movies do best, which allows the audience to kind of anticipate the arrival of something scary.
Mm-hmm.
In horror movies, you're waiting for the monster, whatever it is. You know, whether a literal scary creature or another person or just kind of a haunting in general. And horror movies are really interesting ones because they kind of work in a very meta way, right? You know, you're watching it, it's a horror movie, it's going to be scary. So you're waiting for something scary to happen. And an empty space allows that anticipation because you feel like something should be filling it, right? And that is probably a monster of some sort, whether literal or just a spooky vibe.
Yeah, it literally makes you shiver with anticipation.
Oh, wow.
As Frankfurter would say.
Good call out to the name of the pod.
Thank you. Something that's interesting for us, something that we think about a lot as an organization. We're a rural media organization. We do reporting in rural areas and also think and talk about media representation and things like that. Something that my editor says sometimes, right, is that the surface of the moon is not rural, right?
Totally.
Just an empty landscape filled with nothing is not rural. And so there are lots of horror movies where they're truly in the middle, like they're the only people there.
Yeah.
And that to me doesn't read exactly like a rural, that becomes like sort of a man versus nature situation as opposed to being really a movie that's in or about a rural place, because if you're just in the middle of a national park, like nobody lives there, right? That's not a community.
Yeah, that's a super good point. And it's important for us to remember that when talking about these movies, and I think brings up kind of a different version of this isolation I'm talking about, which is not necessarily being out in the wilderness alone, but being isolated sort of socially or maybe culturally. For instance, like being a stranger in a community or being a stranger among strange folk, new people to you, which goes back to our favorite concept of urbanoia, which we've been talking about in all these episodes. Being a newcomer to a group of people where you feel different, this kind of like othering that happens.
Yeah.
That isolation is something that's going to come up in a lot of the movies we talk about today, along with the landscape isolation that's so common throughout horror movies. So, Anya, what are some of the emotions that come to mind when you think about these isolated situations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the first one is probably helplessness in the most literal sense of the word, which is that there is no one to help.
Yeah.
You know, we've talked about before that something really common in horror movies is that they sort of depend on the institutions that we rely on failing. So police or paramilitary, those like institutional authorities of government, sheriffs, right, have to be ineffectual in order for horror movies to really work and for it to really happen. So all of those institutions of society and civilization have to be absent. But also, I think in these movies, it's really striking when people are removed from their support systems or removed from their social resources that they have that might offer them help, and you're sort of left very much on your own to fend for yourself. And that is where a lot of the terror comes from, is that you've not been training for this. You're just stuck as you are in a situation that you now have to get yourself out of because nobody's coming to help you.
Totally. So yeah, I mean, as you were talking, I feel like some of the words I was hearing, like helpless, unprepared, I feel like you were describing a lot of feelings of anxiety. And I think those emotions that you brought up are really connected to feelings of grief, which can be a really isolating emotion. It's, you know, an intense feeling of sorrow that can make you feel helpless. You feel unprepared for it. You feel an anxiety. And I think that that connection between grief being such an isolating emotion and isolation being so common in horror movies becomes a really interesting thing for us to analyze. And I found grief to be a really common thread in a lot of the movies that we watched.
Yeah.
I've brought up this idea of sort of a monster and other. And I think whatever that is in the different movies, the thing that's supposed to be scary is very effective at representing the emotion of grief and what it can do to someone and how it can kind of disrupt one's way of being and like their way of interacting with the world.
So what are the movies that you're thinking of when we're, talking about grief and isolation?
Yeah, so I want to start with a movie that when I watched it, I felt it to be all just an elaborate metaphor, I guess, for coping with grief, along
Mm.
with also just being, a wildly entertaining and very disturbing horror movie, and that is Midsommar.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So Midsommar is a 2019 horror movie, and I'm going to give a super brief plot summary, but also really recommend everyone watching it. This is one of my favorites that we watched. So, our main character, her name is Dani, and the movie begins with a very traumatic event, which is that her sister kills herself along with her parents.
Mm.
Following this, Dani, while dealing with this tragedy and this grief, goes on a trip with her boyfriend, Christian. Bad boyfriend
Boo.
alert.
We hate him.
He is an insufferable character.
Mm.
But she goes with him and his friends on a trip to rural Sweden to see a midsummer celebration that is happening there. Very long story short, they end up sort of being trapped in this Swedish cult in a series of events, including human sacrifices, sex rituals, murder suicides. It ends up being a very scary place to be. And it doesn't end up going well for everyone there except for Dani, who ends up surviving. And, the ending is a little ambiguous, but it seems that she will, at least for now, be sticking around in Sweden.
Yes.
So that's Midsommar. The first thing I feel that is important to bring up since we're talking about landscapes is compared to other horror movies that we watched and just in general, Midsommar has a really unique landscape for a horror movie because it's really beautiful and sunny and full of flowers. I actually think the only part of the movie that's in the dark is before they go to Sweden at the beginning of the movie. So it's just sort of instantly a different kind of visual experience, but it's still very isolated in the classic ways that we were talking about earlier.
Because the ritual and everything is taking place at midsummer and they're so far north, the sun is literally up for like 22 hours a day, right? So it is an interesting point that normally in horror movies, things are escalating, they're creepy, they're escalating, and when night falls, shit's going to go down.
Exactly.
And in this one, it's just day the whole time.
Yeah, which is like interesting because, the thing we were saying of that feeling of empty space providing anticipation for the scary thing to happen. I feel like you get some clues, like you said, lights go down, maybe a rainstorm starts. You sort of get these visual cues. And in some ways, this movie, you're just constantly on edge because it's always sunny and beautiful and you're waiting for like the shoe to drop,
Yeah, totally.
But there is the classic isolation of their phones don't have service. They're not able to call for help in any real way at all.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's on their phones or making it out of their via phone. There's they don't have cars, the people that are brought there. Yeah.
They don't have any way to get out besides being allowed to leave by the folks in Sweden, which they're not interested in letting anyone go. So those sorts of classic horror trope isolation moments are happening, but there's also isolation that Dani is going through in that she is grieving when she arrives. She's grieving the loss of her family and she's dealing with this trauma. And there was just a couple of things I wanted to point out that felt really important in understanding Dani's grief and how it adds to the horror of the situation. One is that the friend group that she's with, which is her boyfriend and his friends, she's isolated in gender, in this group of male friends with her very unsupportive boyfriend.
And these friends who have literally been like, why are you dating her? Break up with her.
Exactly.
That we've already seen in the beginning of the movies that they are not fans of hers.
That's not her again. Seriously? Oh my God. She needs a therapist, dude.
She has a therapist.
Oh, so then she should call her therapist and not you. It's literally abuse. She's abusing you. Nope.
And they're not fans of hers because they feel like she's too emotional. So, and that was before the loss of her family. So if you think she was emotional then,
It's not necessarily the best idea for her to go on this kind of trip in this situation, but I totally resonate and understand Dani's thought process in doing that, which is, again, goes back to the human fear of being alone, right? Like, she's like, don't want to wallow at home alone. I want to go on this trip and try to do something, but it's really, really difficult. And seeing her coping with all of this isolation of this unsupportive group in this isolated landscape really heightens the emotions of the whole film. Everything in this movie feels a little off, a little wrong. I mean, they have a psychedelic trip, and it kind of feels like the whole situation is a bad trip. And I think the director is just really disorienting the audience in the way that grief can be a really disorienting emotion and kind of warp your world. And I think it's really effective filmmaking, just sort of my film bro moment. But it sort of seems that the situation is mimicking her grief back to us in a really visual way. And again, just pushing the point home one more time about the connection between grief and isolation in horror movies, there's a pretty iconic scene in this movie where Danny, our main character, is crying in despair over something that she's seen, and she's surrounded by the women of this group in Sweden, and they are encircling her and mimicking her cries back to her. It's a really intense scene. Her cries are just like echoing from them. You just like feel this sadness so deeply. That is juxtaposed to at the very beginning when she finds out about the death of her whole family. She calls her boyfriend and is doing the same very, intense cries into the phone.
Hey. Danny. Babe.
But we only hear her crying. We hear her isolated and alone. Then in some sort of a little bit of a twisted way, she finds a community to cry with her in Sweden.
Yeah, and, share her emotions and also make them, I think, more visible. Something that we see, I mean, this is a really overwhelming trip, and there are multiple times Dana gets overwhelmed and she sort of runs off to be alone to cry somewhere. So she's feeling these overwhelming feelings and she needs to get them out, but she doesn't want it to be in front of anybody, and she, especially her boyfriend and his friends, because they already think she's a burden and she doesn't want to burden them. And so she runs away to go cry in private, and this is something she does 3 or 4 times throughout the movie. And then here's this moment where she, again, is actually in the process of, she's trying to run off so she can go cry. And the women stop her and surround her and then have this moment with her, giving her permission to do that publicly instead of having to hide it. I can imagine it would be cathartic if super intense, which is, maybe a large part of her experience in the movie would be described as sort of cathartic, but also really intense.
It's like the most extreme coping mechanisms. I don't know if killing your boyfriend or being an accessory to his death is a good way to cope, but she ends the film kind of smiling. And it's, I think, incredibly debatable if this is a happy ending, but
I'm for it.
Yeah, my analysis of this is she ends the movie as a queen, as someone who is loved and supported in a way her boyfriend wasn't. And like we said, she sort of found a community that's willing to cry and grieve with her. And I think it's a pretty interesting way of showing what you might need in this time of grief and isolation. I think we're going to talk about gender a good bit in this episode. It's not a fully gendered podcast, so we won't be doing the deepest of dives. I'm sure if, you ever meet us in person, we'll be happy to do that with you.
A little too happy.
Yeah. But of the movies we are talking about today, this is the one with the female protagonist, and she finds community to deal with her grief, which often in horror movies, male protagonists choose to isolate themselves, which is a big theme in the next movie I want to talk about, which we'll get to right after this short break.
Hi, I'm Janie Carey with the Daily Yonder. Check out the Yonder Report, a weekly podcast rounding out the latest rural news produced by the Daily Yonder and Public News Service. You can listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
So the next movie is an Indigenous Canadian film called The Edge of the Knife. This is the first ever feature film that's spoken entirely in the Haida language, which is an Indigenous language currently considered to be endangered.
Yeah, and so this is actually a really interesting movie in terms of its background and its creation. It is, small budget, very small production feature film movie, and they filmed it entirely in Haida, which involved having these several weeks long language training camps to train many of the actors in the language because they didn't speak it initially. So it was both this like linguistic revival mechanism and also, of course, created this feature film, which tells a traditional Haida story of the wild man, or somebody who sort of their humanity declines through survival and then they become wild.
Yeah.
Super interesting background to the movie. Most of the cast and crew, it was their first time ever working on a movie.
Yeah.
The results are super crazy, knowing that that's true. Yeah.
Stapo hagang kangi chagang ponsuga.
Right. It's very impressive. Definitely really different than I think any movie I'd seen. I'm really glad we watched this one for the project. I'll give a short summary of the movie. There are two families gathering for an annual fishing retreat, and one of the men causes the accidental death of his best friend's son, and his guilt and grief causes him to run out into the wilderness as he's tormented by what he's done, and he kind of falls into insanity and, like you were saying, Anya, becomes this supernatural being that is becoming wild. You see him really in a just hard to see situation. You know, he has spores coming out of his body. He's crazed by hunger. It's just a very intense transformation.
He eats a sea urchin just with his face.
Yeah.
And then has sea urchin in his face for most of the movie. And that, to me, like, and we watched a lot of gross, scary things over the course of this, but for me, sea urchin scene, I literally could not handle that one.
It was nauseating.
Both hands were in front of my eyes for that one.
Yeah. He unexpectedly survives the winter, and at the next year's gathering, when the families have returned, they try to and succeed in converting him back out of the wild man back to himself. So recommend you watch this movie, but that is your brief summary of what happened. So yeah, I mean, Anu, you already said it was gross in some parts, but what did you think of this movie?
I feel like one of the things that made this movie different for me in a way that I sort of loved was that it was a problem that could be solved.
Yeah.
And I feel like most of the ones that we watch, the horror is sort of maybe inherently built in because they're these like intractable conflicts or these forces that nobody understands. If a killer hillbilly is after you, you run away or you kill them. They're like, you can't just say, hey, maybe stop doing that, and then they'll be like, for sure, okay. Exactly. Right. Like there's not a ritual you can do. And of course, you know, in exorcist movies and things like that, there are rituals that you can do. And this is, I think, maybe the only movie that I've ever seen, except for the ones where they just kill the villains, where there is a threat. It is existential and scary and bad. And also it is dealt with.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I thought that sort of opened up this whole other can of worms of things to think about, because normally that's not the case.
Right. I mean, he is saved. This ritual happens by community. He's pulled out of his grief and trauma and guilt by the people around him, which, you know, we see with Midsommar in a pretty different way, but you see a character able to find change and transformation through community. But before that happens, I just think it's so interesting, because we've been talking about the connection between an isolated landscape and grief as an emotion in horror movies, how deeply connected they are in this movie, because he literally turns into the landscape that he's in, right? The interconnectedness is so visible that you can't separate the man from the landscape. They are one and the same. The isolation that he is in because of the island that they're on and the rural area that they're in, but also that he is experiencing grief and guilt in a way that isolates him from his whole community and traumatizes him beyond recognition.
Yeah, and I mean, another point along with that is that they have a community on that island, but it's a seasonal community. So they come and they go depending on what needs they have. And, you know, I think that there's a certain time of every year where they gather there to fish. After this accident, which was right before they were all about to leave, he runs into the woods and they have no choice but to leave him. The weather's coming in. They have to go.
Yeah.
And so he is stuck there for a year, basically, as this transformation happens. It is through the return of his family and friends that he is able to be pulled out of that and return to himself.
Yeah. It's very interesting that his initial reaction to the guilt that he feels and his grief is to run away and to isolate himself. And I think there's a lot of gender things in that. You know, if you're feeling an emotion that strong and you are a man, you better go deal with that on your own by yourself. I can't say that, like, if he had just talked to his friend, it would have been fine. You know, I don't know if
Probably not. Yeah.
But it's notable that we see Danny in Midsommar call someone immediately in her trauma, and this character goes away by himself and isolates himself.
Yeah, no, I mean, she is reaching out sort of desperately the whole time, and he is hiding. Yeah, which, you know, he feels horrible. I get it.
Yeah.
In this movie, after the main character has run away, there is still plenty of grieving going on in the community because it was his best friend's son. But I think there's this really interesting scene that contrasts specifically, right, with this sort of grieving that he is going through when he has run away and gone by himself, which is that the mother is surrounded by the women of the community, and she cuts off her hair and they're wailing. It's a similar cathartic sort of noise-making process as we see in Midsommar. And so I think it's really cool to have both of these scenes in the same movie because it makes it possible to make a sort of more interesting and accurate comparison of here's what the main character has gone off and done by himself, and here's what his community is doing, and specifically the women of his community are doing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think speaking of grieving comparisons and different ways of grieving, the other kind of grief that I wanted to bring up that happens in horror movies isn't this necessarily trauma from another event like we talked about in Midsommar. It's Danny's family being killed. In The Edge of the Knife, it's the accidental death of this young boy, but a kind of situation of grieving for yourself because you're in a horror movie, right? Like that you're something terrifying is happening and you're grieving your situation, which is a different sort of thing. It's very, I guess, meta again of like, oh, you're in a horror movie, everything's going wrong. How do different characters grieve for themselves in their situation?
And grieve for the people that they're with in their situation.
Yeah.
If they do, which I think, honestly, you don't see that much.
Well, yeah. So what are some different ways you see characters in horror movies dealing with the horror of their situations?
I mean, I think so much of it, if you think about the classic slasher, right? You are in it. There's no time. Like, I think the first person who dies or you discover their absence maybe gets sort of the most felt feelings. But after that, you know, things are escalating and you're literally being chased. Like, there's no time for it. And I think that in a lot of movies, you just don't, the people just, the survival instinct is really what it's all about. And that stuff sort of gets pushed to the side.
Yeah.
One movie that we talked about last episode is The Hills Have Eyes. The family members are getting picked off one by one. There is a time when the three sort of remaining adults in the group are mourning for them, but that goes pretty quick because they end up having to use their mother's body as bait to help lure out the villains and ultimately defeat them. So which isn't, you know, the most sentimental act you can do.
Right, because grieving or mourning is often, you know, a weakness in these sort of quick-paced movies, which is like you said, you don't have time to like pause and reflect because you have to keep going, right? If your grief brings you into a paralysis, that's not going to go well for you. Maybe we see more often grief spurring you into action, right? Like the revenge, the I have to survive to honor this person who didn't, or I refuse to end up the same way.
And I'll say that the, you know, paralysis, when it's shown, it's paralysis parentheses derisive, right? Like it's also in The Hills Have Eyes, the younger sister has been brutally raped. Her sister and mother have both been killed, and she's sort of catatonic for a while. And it's her brother and her brother-in-law are still around, and the brother says, "Ugh, she hasn't said a word all night." Right. And it's like,
Of course she hasn't.
Yeah, so like when it is, even though it's completely understandable, when it is shown like you said as being weak, and she has to snap right out of it if she's going to help defeat the mutant family, which she does eventually.
Yeah, that I think is a really good transition into another movie that we talked about last time that I want to bring up again, which is Deliverance. Because there's another interesting gendered component to how they grieve their situation, specifically after the sexual assault that occurs, because they never talk about it, again, basically for the whole movie. I think in the ways they address it are at the end of the movie, there's a line where one of the men says to the other, basically, I don't think we'll be seeing each other again for a while, kind of acknowledging they went through something traumatic and shameful, therefore they should isolate themselves. Therefore they should not talk about it. They shouldn't meet up again to discuss their feelings.
They're not starting a support group. They're running away from each other.
The only member of the canoeing party who seems to be a little bit different is the character Drew, who after the scene of the sexual assault, he is the most visibly upset and, grieving for their situation and really showing the emotion of what has happened to them. But notably, he is the only one of the four who doesn't survive. It's a little ambiguous on how he dies. It's one of the sort of questions of the movie, but what it looks like to me and to a lot of people is that he kills himself out of the emotion he's feeling of this traumatic event.
And he's the one that doesn't want to just bury the body and move on. He's the one that sort of wants to go to the law.
Yeah.
Turn over the highway patrol. Tell them what happened.
Tell them what? Exactly.
It's just what happened. I mean, it's a justifiable homicide, if anything is. They were sexually assaulting two members of our party at gunpoint. Like you said, there was nothing else we could do.
And in a movie about sort of becoming men and testing your manliness against the wild and against, villains, he's the one that isn't man enough. You watch these movies and the movie ends and then you're like, oh, but what happens to you afterwards? And Deliverance is also one of the few movies that gives you a tiny little snippet, which is that at the end of the movie, they've returned back to suburban Atlanta where they all live. And you see Ed in his home with his wife and his young child. And then at the end, he has this nightmare where it's a hand rising from the reservoir. That's sort of the only indication you get in most movies that, this has left a lasting impression. Yeah. Like you said, he's with his wife. She says, what's wrong? He's like, oh, nothing,
He's still not going to talk about it.
He's not talking about it with the people that went through it with him. Yeah. And he's also not talking about it with his wife, his partner.
Yeah. So I think we brought up a lot of different components that we could go on about for a really long time, talking about isolation of landscapes, grief in horror movies, the gendered components of grief. These are all areas rich for discussion. The last thing I want to say is that a lot of the male characters we see in these movies really use the isolating landscapes to isolate themselves in their grief, whereas the female protagonist we talked about today, Danny, she finds a community in her isolating time, a community of women. Again, we're not saying it's, wow, what an amazing, happy ending, great coping mechanisms, but she finds peace in a pretty messed up way.
If I were her, I'd join the cult.
Absolutely. So I just want to leave us with thinking about how grief in horror movies can be incredibly connected and think about the role that the landscape might play in heightening those emotions.
Yeah, thank you. That's been so interesting to talk about. And, you watch Midsommar and it sort of hits you in the face that this is a movie about grief. But I think that that's not something I've thought about for a lot of the other ones. And there is that connection there, I think, in every single one of them, sort of at the very least, grieving, like you said, the situation that they're in.
Yeah. You can't talk about horror movies without talking about trauma. They're so one and the same.
Yeah. And in some cases, you can't watch horror movies without being a little traumatized also.
Well, luckily, you and I are dealing with that by talking to each other on a podcast instead of keeping to ourselves.
So true. Yeah, and I promise not to run off into the woods and or suburban Atlanta and never speak of it again.
Thank God.
I'll speak to you next week.
Yeah.
And a lot of times before then, too. The Rural Horror Picture Show is a product of Rural Remix. Original music was composed by Quincy Ponver and Leo Pozell. Cover art for the series was drawn by Nat Nichols. Thank you to our executive producers, Joel Cohen and Adam Georgie, associate producer Teresa Collins, and the staff of the Daily Yonder and Rural Assembly. This series was edited and produced by Susanna Brown and Anya Patron-Slepian.